pleasure of talking with Gonda Van Steen. And Gonda, please share with us a little bit about what you do professionally and how you first became interested in the ISS archives.
Sure. I'm originally from Flanders, Belgium, but I've spent many years teaching in the US, and I took a position in the UK in 2018. So I'm a little bit of a migrant worker of academia, as we call it. But I sympathize also with international adoptees who have crossed borders. We have a lot of points in common, even though I'm not adopted. I trained as a classicist in ancient Greek and Latin, and I've moved now solidly into the study of Greece in the 20th century. And I thought that kind of read a lot of detail about the history of Greece in the 20th century, until one day in 2013, I received an email from the son of a person who was adopted from Greece. And he asked for more information and had nothing to offer him. And I almost felt embarrassed that for all this specializing, I'd really had nothing to offer to the descendant of an adoptee, whose questions are still urgent because adoption is inherited, is what I say. And so I thought, okay, I need to make some work of this, right? And I started unraveling the history of Greek adoptions based on this one case and discovering that there were close to 4,000 cases, and that the ISS had quite a prominent role in these intercountry adoptions as the only one of about 7 or 8 mediators, the very only one who did things ethically and professionally, to the extent that they were the only one for the Greek cases who compiled proper files. And to my great joy, I started working with Linnea Anderson in Minnesota, who made materials available upon request, always with names protected and personal information protected. And I would just nag Linnea for more and more information as I got deeper into it. And out of that study came a book in 2019 that is called Adoption, Memory, and Cold War Greece. And it is really a Cold War phenomenon for Greece to be sending children from poor families or illegitimate children, as they were then called, to a better future in the US. That practice has become controversial in recent years, but it is heartening to see that the ISS really studied the phenomenon as it was practicing it and was really referring to social science literature, was communicating very intensely between offices overseas, with the US office, with the Geneva office, with the German office, a very intense communication, really driven by the desire to do things professionally. Even though today we would hold international adoption to different standards, but for the 1950s, this was really pioneering work.
Yeah. So, Gonda, you referred to the ISS Adoption Archives in your writings as, quote, the gold vein of social and family history of the 20th century. Can you tell us more about why you think this and some of the surprising things or interesting things that you've discovered in going through IS archival material, either in the US or in Greece or elsewhere?
Yeah. First of all, I want to clarify that I don't retain, that I've been able to see some files in what we call the aggregate, meaning you see detail, but there's so much of it that you can't retain it. There is no violation of personal information in the sense that I don't take notes or so. But what I noticed, just going through a few representative files, is that the ISS is really in the forefront of its time, referring, for instance, to psychological literature, to literature on child rearing, is in touch with the prominent medical doctors and pediatricians of Greece at the time to make sure that these children undergo, for instance, the proper medical tests before they are cleared for adoption in the US, that they're also constantly consulting with legal authorities to make sure that the child travels with all the proper paperwork that has to make the adoption in the United States legal, so that again the child is covered for the future in the United States, that include not only adoption but also naturalization and eventually the attainment of US citizenship. So there's a lot of forethought about what the child will need. And there is also already the first efforts of people who want to be reconnected with their biological family or siblings, and an acknowledgement that people are owed the knowledge of their past. And so we see all of that transpire in the ISS files well before it even becomes a thing in the Greek adoption world. Now, because it's also beautifully documented and letters are exchanged, there is nothing alike in the Greek world when it comes to archival treasures. The other adoptee mediators did not keep proper files or destroyed them. Some actively destroyed them. And also in the making of Greek history, social records were always considered less important. Greece has given more significance to political records or personal memoirs or diplomacy records or US-Greek relations. All of that kind of material was prioritized in a culture that does indeed show the leftovers of a patriarchal power structure. So what happened in families and in personal circumstances was just less important. So we have not a single organized archive from mid-20th century Greece that delves into families and personal circumstances, except for the ISSs.
Wow, wow.
That's how critical I can posit it. And now thinking ahead of future researches, when personal data protection will have exceeded its expiration date, let's say, in future years, people will be able to study families, children, poverty, economic crisis, the stigma of illegitimacy, based on records that are not only available, which is a big thing, but also are typed and are in English, which is again unheard of. We consider that as the most logical thing, but the ISS people took their notes, handwritten notes, and make sure that they transcribed every important piece. So to have a record that is open not only to Greek researchers, but also to Greek researchers who don't master, to researchers of Greece who don't master Greek, is amazing. It is just one of a kind.
That's incredible. What impact do you think the archives have had on our understanding in general of the field of intercountry adoption?
There is an understanding that we need to be paying more attention to biological families. And mothers do sign consent. The ISS would not proceed without consent, but consent, closed records, and an adoption that is also a no-contact adoption forever after is really quite a new cultural phenomenon in Greece of the 1950s and in other countries too. This is a post-war emergency solution to a crisis that affected children in a post-war era where families were very much disrupted. And I don't think we were ready in the 1950s to think ahead about the many questions that adoptees would eventually be asking. So what we saw as a better life and a clean slate and a new slate, blank slate adoption in the US is not exactly how it worked out for many adoptees. They grow up and they do have questions. And fortunately, the ISS has preserved the social histories, mostly of the biological mother, but there are questions there that need to be answered. And again, it's again to the ISS Greece credit that they are the only ones to this day who professionally engage with searches, reunifications, based on what information they have kept. But I see a small discrepancy here. There were adjustment reports on the child and how the adopted family was doing. That was a requirement to make sure that the child and the family go through a certain kind of probationary period and really are well matched before an adoption was made official in US courts. There was not in the same way attention paid to an adjustment of the biological mother who had just given up her child. The interaction with the biological mother ends with her signing a release that the child can move on, and she's guaranteed that that will be done professionally, and that puts her at ease. But we do not learn what becomes of her 10 years later, 50 years later. Is she forever happy with the record being private and confidential? When we meet adoptive mothers who are biological mothers who are in their 90s, they have only one question left, and that is, what became of the child? And they have no way to start a search because the Greek law doesn't support it to this day. So adjustment reports were excluded continued attention to the biological parent. And some mothers really suffered from a lifetime trauma of having given up a child. And some never had children again. It was so traumatic. Even though they consented to confidentiality, but confidentiality, if you ask them 50 years later, confidentiality was not a lifetime contract in their mind.
Right. I think nobody anticipated what they were getting into at that time. I think there was really, people didn't know because it hadn't been tested.
And
Very interesting. That's a really interesting perspective and a really welcome one to think about the impact on.
We speak, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, of 60 years, 70 years of hindsight. And again, I find an openness in the ISS to deal with that and to see a continued responsibility associated with the adoption practice that it instituted in the 1950s. And I want to make clear that Greece and Greek adoptions were very much in the forefront. Greek adoptions were well underway before the Korean adoptions took a peak, let's say. So in a way, Greece and Korea provide the blueprint. Yes. And for Korea, that's known. For Greece, that is not known. So I'm here to kind of make that clear as well, that through the ISS Greek office and then also through the Korean adoptions, this is how intercountry adoption was solidified and the fight was on immediately to speak out against proxy adoptions. For Greece, those were adoptions by the other and I call those brokers. For Korea, that was an opposition against the whole complex, that I call it that. So they were the ISS was not only practicing adoptions, but really intent on sharing best practices about adoption. And occasionally even being the bad guy for clamoring about bad practices that the others were instituting. Yeah, and I want to say something about the financial aspect. There's a lot of talk about stolen and sold children in Greece because these items get very easily sensationalized. And I'm always the first one to kind of tone that down a bit because I've seen very, very many release statements of mothers. And if that, you have to kind of take those as evidence as well. So the ISS charged for an adoption from Greece to the US, $115 US. $115 US.
And then probably didn't even cover the cost of any of it.
Actually, it very often, the internal correspondence says, well, we fell about $5 short, but we're not going to bug the adoptive parents about that. We'll just eat up the cost. $115, while at the same time, brokers of Greek adoptions were charging $3,000. Wow. But ISS, and then the ISS says some parents will actually even pay those, or plenty of parents will pay those $3,000 because the others can promise speed. You know, they want a child and they want it fast. In fact, they want it as fast as possible. Even though for a natural child, one would have to wait 9 months, some lawyers in Greece could deliver a child in as little as 2 weeks. And so the ISS says some parents are really kind of blinded by the speedy nature of the procedure, not knowing that that leaves the child vulnerable and that leaves themselves vulnerable. And so even though they put themselves in a certain kind of isolation for insisting on better practices, they stick to their guns in very admirable ways.
Tell me a little bit about your experience working with adult adoptees and what impact this work is having on the community, and how is that evolving into really the future best practices of the work today.
Well, it's very interesting. So I started this research by accident in 2013, and it's not left me alone since. In 2013, I was actually looking for people to interview and finding it very hard to build trust with them because they carried adoption from Greece as a bit of a stigma. They felt they were the odd ones out, and they also always thought they were the only ones. And then from that came the request to talk to me and could I read their Greek papers? Could I help with the translation? And so it became a give and take. And I must emphasize there's never any money involved. I do this. My gift is that I can learn. Their gift is that they may finally learn what their Greek document said after all those years. But then they helped me, everyone knows maybe of one other person, and they helped me build a network. And they also very much wanted to be in touch with each other. And from that, we have now found 3,000 of the 4,000 Greek adoptees, which is incredible. And
that is incredible.
They talk to each other, they exchange information, they go and visit with each other, they travel together. And from that came their own form of activism. Because I don't want to be the one who tells them what to do, but my work and my methodology is very much informed in an upstream kind of way. They tell me what is important. And then I think, wait a minute, they're right. I should assist him in pursuing this. For instance, I made it known that the ISS is very willing to open their personal files to them. Up until 2 years ago, those were hard copy files, and I would give out the address and send a note over to the Greek office saying, hey, so-and-so is coming, but please assist. From the paperwork I've seen, this all looks very legit. Please collaborate. And that actually gave some incentive to the ISS to start digitizing their file, both for preservation because researchers are interested, but also because the individual people would like to receive the essence of their files. And so they now have digitized 91,000 pages and make those available following up on those individual requests, and have really kind of reshaped their relationships with the adoptees by doing so. And they're involved in our activities, and they come to our events, and we do collaborative events just because this dialogue has been so productive. One of the items that the adoptees taught me that is important to them and I didn't expect at all is that they want their citizenship of birth restored.
Interesting.
And I always felt that maybe they were disappointed in their country of birth. After all, they were kind of dispatched, right? No, they want their citizenship of birth restored. Whether they were babies or 10 years old, they were born Greek, and they want that recognized by their country. And so I always tell them that, again, they're in luck if they have an ISS file, because there is critical documentation there. Some files are up to 400 pages long. I mean, no other Greek child in the 1950s has a 400-page long file. It is excellent documentation to show that you came from Greece, and excellent kind of secondary evidence that you have every right to request the confirmation of your Greek citizenship. And so we're sponsoring and spearheading a campaign to bring awareness to that request and to really lead the way with the officers who can give their approval to that request, that these people get their Greek passport and their Greek citizenship restored. And as they say it, I was born Greek and I want to die Greek. That's how.
That's amazing. Have you seen that in the other adoptee communities, in the Korean community and the Chinese community and the Ethiopian community? Have you seen similar?
It is a similar desire that is very vibrant among the Korean adoptees who are ahead of us, among the 40,000 Guatemalan adoptees who seem to have an easy path to restoring citizenship. Mm-hmm. So it's different in various countries, and we do actually communicate with these other groups to kind of have arguments to present to the Greek government as to why this is the proper thing to do, and not to be some sort of a social stigma, that a history that Greece doesn't want to be reminded of, but a factor to be embraced. Greece welcoming its own citizens back who want to come, who want to bring their children, who want to spend winter in the country, who want to spend money, all sorts of good things, who want to learn the language, kind of a mild engagement, not an aggressive touristic engagement, but a mild engagement with local culture from which they come. And that is very visible in their genetic makeup.
That is amazing. So in thinking now about the future, what do you think are some of the most important steps ISS as a global network can take to support adoptees and others? There are a lot of people who have become separated from their past, their cultures, and their identities. So in thinking about where should we go from here? I mean, we've gotten to 100 years. Where do we go from here? What are some key things that you think ISS could be really helpful in thinking about the future of this work and thinking about how important people's past cultures and identities really are to them?
So I think the ISS could play a very active role in supporting the identity rights of adoptees, but also others who got separated from their paperwork or their families. And there are groups out there who really identify identity rights as human rights. So that is definitely a step to take, given that the ISS really holds the key to critical documents that support that. I would also encourage that the ISS participates in as many research projects as possible, and also continues its stance to make adoptions happen, if they have to happen, by the most legal ways forward, because unfortunately adoption histories are very much tainted by scandal and have been for many decades. So it is very important to take the professional and ethical high ground and to keep up that tradition, even if that makes for slower procedures or even for a renegotiation of the model of adoption altogether, a caretaking model that doesn't necessarily have to be adoption, aligned with all the conventions that have supported new ways and more legal ways of protecting vulnerable children.